last year, Saudi Arabia proposed the circular carbon economy, endorsed in the 2020 G20 leaders declaration by all G20 countries as a holistic, integrated, inclusive, and pragmatic approach to managing emissions based on the 4 Rs. By encompassing the broad range of pathways and options available, CCE considers different national circumstances while striving to meet our shared global aspirations, including its specific resource endowment and its political, economic, environmental, social, and risk-informed development context. CCE is an energy strategy that advocates the 3 Rs of environmentalism: reduce, reuse, and recycle carbon. Crucially, however, it adds a 4th R, remove, in an effort to eliminate emissions from the atmosphere, making the 4 Rs of CCE reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove. For sustainable energy transitions, utilization of all energy sources and innovative technologies will offer opportunities to further advance clean energy transitions. This public debate discusses the circular carbon economy as an essential mean to a low-carbon future through coordinated G20 efforts towards carbon circularity and neutrality. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists and start with our first speaker, Luiz de MELLO, the Director of Economic Department at the OECD, and he's also the lead co-chair of our T20 Italy Task Force 2 on Climate Change, Sustainable Energy, and Environment. Luiz, if I can invite you and give you the floor. The transition towards carbon neutrality and circularity is a top priority for the years to come. What are the main issues on climate change and energy transition covered by your task force that you're leading?
Thank you very much, Noura, for your question, for your introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you, with John. You are my two fellow co-chairs of the task force, but also to have Antonio with us. Also great pleasure to have Manal, who is contributing great work to the task force, and Yoshi the same. So great pleasure. Noura, you give me a very good opportunity to bring to the table what the task force is doing in this very important area of decarbonization of our economies more broadly. If you allow me to cast it in this broader light, and I think we all agree that decarbonization is really a very important step towards meeting the agreed climate change targets that we have before us. And decarbonization is a very complex endeavor. It requires action really across a very broad range of policy areas. And the task force is looking at several of those with the ambition, needless to say, to bring to the G20 very good ideas, concrete proposals that can then enrich the discussions among the G20 countries and contribute to concrete steps in this direction. Let me mention, to begin with, 3 broad policy areas that are essential for decarbonizing our economies. I mean, one is obviously innovation. We need technological change to help us make sure that our production processes, our economies can become less reliant on carbon fuels. The other one is regulation and standards to make sure that we put forward the regulations that are conducive to this transition path. And another one is obviously everything that has to do with investment that will be needed as well in this process. Let me start now with innovation and regulation, and then perhaps we can come back to investment later on. But technological improvements will be needed here to decarbonize our economies. If you think, for instance, at the cost of some technologies like PV panels or batteries. 20 years ago, and the cost that we have, that we pay, you know, for the price that we pay for those technologies, there has been a sea change over the period of about 20 years. There are new technologies that already exist that need to be deployed. There are new technologies that will need to be created to address the challenges of this transition. But I think the key message here is that there are a number of policy instruments to facilitate that. Subsidies and tax credits, for instance, for research and development in areas that are conducive to decarbonization. Issues related to removing harmful subsidies for fossil fuels, for example, that so many of our economies still have. So those are very important budgetary, fiscal, if you want, instruments that can be used to support innovation. And the task force is looking at some of those across the different topics that we're looking at. Let me turn to regulation and standards. Again, very important in this area to make sure that we have the regulatory framework that will be conducive to this transition. One important element there related to this, and Manal, I think you'll come back to some of these issues in your own intervention, given the work that you are doing here. But one important recognition here, Noura, is that you know, by raising our standards in this area, there will be costs that will need to be faced, and the task force is looking at some of these transition costs. No, workers, for instance, that may lose their jobs in the process of economic restructuring through the transition need to be supported. So everything that has to do with equipping people with the skills, with education that is needed, the competences that is needed to go through this transition will be important. Improving activation and the retraining programs for some of the workers that will be displaced. They are also important aspects in this transition. Improving social safety nets for the most vulnerable ones. That's another important aspect to make sure that the transition is fair and just. No, that's another ambition that we have and that the task force is looking at. Let me mention two concrete cases: sustainable development education to empower the youth. We know the young workers may be at risk during this transition if they don't have the right skills and competences for that. So the task force is looking at that. Climate resilience in least developed and developing countries. It's not only heterogeneous effects of policies during the transition within countries, but also across countries in the world. So these are also very important aspects that we need to look at. Sustainable cities. You know, let's not forget, a lot of the decarbonization needs will take place in large metropolitan areas. That's where people live. That's where energy consumption is high. That's why it's so important to look at sustainability and decarbonization issues, given the specificities of cities. Let me just give you a number, Noura. Take the housing sector alone. Housing, along with transport, are two sectors that are responsible for a lot of the bulk of emissions nowadays. Housing alone, 1/5 almost of emissions of greenhouse gases. About 40% of emissions of fine particulates. So there are lots of policy requirements to decarbonize the sector that are very specific, and the task force is looking at as well. And let's not forget to bring back to the core issue that you mentioned at the beginning, the circular economy. What are the specifics of the circular economy that we can look at? The task force is looking at plastics, for instance. We know that recycling rates in plastics are very small, very low. So how can we make sure that there is appropriate regulations? Regulations, for instance, in the case of the use of single-use plastics. That's a very important regulatory aspect that goes along all the other issues related to fiscal instruments, related to investment needs, and that the task force is looking at, and that we hope to have, again, very concrete proposals that we can then convey to the G20 for action in this area. But I'll probably stop here, Nora. We can pick up on some of these issues in follow-up questions, if you allow.
Thank you very much, Luiz, for this excellent overview on priority topics of global challenges on climate change and environment that the task force is tackling. And hopefully recommendations from the task force will be endorsed at the G20 level. And we see this momentum being accelerated in this platform. Moving to our next speaker, John KIRTON, the director of G20 Research Group in Canada, and also the co-chair of our T20 Italy Task Force 2 on climate change, sustainable energy, and environment. John, the T20 is the intellectual backbone of the G20 and one that offers an ideas bank for global pressing issues. It is an accumulation of efforts from across the globe on priority topics that beg for action. As a long-serving co-chair of Task Force 2, what are the key messages of this task force and how did it evolve over the years? John, if I can give you the floor, I think you're muted. Yes.
Okay. Does that work?
Yes.
Ça va, merci. So thanks, Nora, and everyone for their patience. I think Luiz wisely signaled that the Think 20 always has been much more than an ideas bank where anyone can borrow what they want at any time. Its central purpose is to recommend to G20 leaders what they should adopt as commitments at their next summit, and then have their countries comply with those commitments when they go back home. And here the facts show, sadly, that the Think 20 has hitherto had limited success, with few of its recommendations actually making a difference in this fully extended way. In recent years, our task force 2 on the environment, has really stood out among its 10 or so other task force colleagues. It's attracted many more participants, many more policy briefs than the others. And I think that reflects the growing importance and urgency of our central concern, climate change. But still proportionately few of Task Force 2 recommendations have been sent by the T20 as a whole as priorities onto the G20, and even fewer have been turned into G20 commitments and compliance. And that's why we're working hard to do a better job this year. So this year, Task Force 2 has selected 15 of the best 130 proposals it's received to become policy briefs to be sent up to the T20 as a whole. And it is a broad agenda, as Luiz indicated, but these 15 policy briefs have admirably given greater attention to nature-based solutions serving as carbon sinks than Think 20 Task Force 2 has done before. The old focus was more on emission sources from fossil fuels, sometimes adding new technologies that have yet to prove their worth. But now we have a greater balance between sinks and sources. In particular, this year's top 15 that have been selected have added agriculture as an important component. And another, I think, important development, we're relying much more on the impressive work of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to show how nature-based solutions are essential to sustain and to share inclusively the economic growth that so many poor people need and want. The most recent OECD report unveiled just a few days ago emphasizes that there is no economic growth without growing nature. That is now the fundamental fact. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Indeed, nature is part and parcel in climate change mitigation, and putting a price on that will help accelerate this momentum. Moving to our next speaker, Yoshikazu Kobayashi is a senior economist in Planning and Administration Unit under the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Yoshi, reducing CO2 emissions drastically will require the participation of hard-to-abate sectors, such as oil, gas, aluminum, iron, steel, cement, and petrochemicals, as well as heavy transport, including heavy-duty road transport, shipping, and aviation. Combined, these comprise a total of 37% of CO2 emissions. So reaching acceptable temperature thresholds cannot be achieved without first reaching emissions neutrality, coupled with significantly ramped up efforts to deploy and use negative emissions technologies. In turn, these goals cannot be achieved without moving hard-to-abate sectors towards sustainability. Can you talk about the technology innovations options across the 4 R's of CCE, reduce, reuse, recycle, and remove, particularly to transition the hard-to-abate sectors towards carbon circularity and neutrality? I give you the floor, Yoshi. Yoshi, you're muted.
Yeah, good.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, thank you, Nora, for your kind introduction. I'm Yoshi Kobayashi from the Institute of Energy Economics Japan, or IEEJ. I was actually involved in one of the policy briefs in last year's T20 works. So I'm very happy to be back to the T20 forum this year again and continue the discussions on the very important topic, like advancing the circular carbon economy. I'd like to start with the reality in the net zero endgame. As recently IEA published new report on a net zero scenario on a global basis as of 2050. And some of debatable descriptions on the fossil fuel investments caught lots of media attentions. But another important remarks of the report, in my opinion, is that even in the global net zero scenario, as of 2050, some 20% of primary energy supply will come from fossil fuels. So we need to understand that we cannot, at least based on the currently considered technology and the reasonably expected development of that technology, we will still need the fossil fuel in the primary energy mix, even in the net zero energy balance. So what we need to seriously think about, in my opinion, is that how to decarbonize the use of fossil fuel. The slide figure shows the Japan's path toward net zero emissions towards 2050. We will certainly adopt renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies, but still we have some residual fossil fuel use in both in power and non-power sectors. And those residual carbon emissions will be offset by negative emissions technologies like DSCs and zinc and BECCS and so on. So back into questions from Dr. Mansouri. This is a table from our last year's report on CCE. we provided technologies for each of 4Rs. By the way, in our categorizations, 4R reduce is reducing the amount of carbon entering the economy. This is the first step in our climate change actions, but still, we will have some unreduced carbon emission even after the intensive use of reduced technologies. Then we will capture the residual carbon and utilize for the carbon for other purposes without or with chemical conversion. And then we will still have some residual carbons which could not be captured and utilized in reuse and recycle. Then we will remove the carbons, unutilized carbon as a final step. So this is 4R categorizations in circular carbon economies. And regarding the question from Dr. Mansouri on the unabated emissions, particularly in hard-to-abate sectors in industries. In the reduced sector, the first things what we should do is certainly energy conservation or efficiency improvement. We tend to under-evaluate the value of efficiency improvement in the discussion of net zero emission target, because efficiency improvement itself will not bring us to the net zero, but still in the transitional period, there are many things to be done in terms of efficiency improvement. Particularly in the developing world, there are lots of low-hanging fruits which we can reduce a large amount of carbons at a relatively low cost. And we also have hydrogen, either from fossil fuel sources or renewable sources. Hydrogen can be utilized for heat or processing or reduction process in steel making. We can utilize ammonia as a fuel for the boiler in the industrial sector. So that is another solution in the hard-to-abate sector. And also in cement industry, we can expect recycle technologies like concrete curing, absorbing CO2. In some applications, combined with efficiency improvement or recycling, utilizing recycled material in concrete making, we can even expect that net zero concrete productions. And also we will expect some of the methanation processes from steel making. In steel making, in the conventional steel making process utilizing cokes, we will have CO2 emissions. We will utilize that emitted CO2 with green hydrogen, produce methane, and they utilize it for fuel for steel making process. So this is another innovation technologies. Some of these technologies are close to commercialization, like concrete curing, but other technologies like reduction process utilizing the hydrogen may take some time to get the competitive for commercializations. And one other thing I like to add in this emission reduction efforts in the industrial sector is the CCS. If we are realistic, we will have some unabated CO2 emissions from industry sector, even with this adoption of innovative technologies. Then we will need CCS as a final solution, or remove technology in 4R categorizations. So this series of technology will address the emissions issues in the hard-to-abate sector. And that's it for myself.
Thank you very much, Yoshi, for this very important overview on innovations in CCE. And one of the advantages of CCE is really allowing the participation of the hard-to-abate sector, which makes up 37% of global CO2. Moving to our next speaker, Dr. Manal Shihabi, the KFAS OIES Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Dr. Manal, energy transition pathways must deliver continued economic growth, universal energy access per UN SDG 7, climate change mitigation per UN SDG 13, and decarbonization targets per the Paris Agreement. And many market-based efforts are being pursued to achieve emissions neutrality, including emissions trading and carbon taxes, and the CCE approach. What do you think is the primary obstacle preventing effective implementation of decarbonization pathways and CCE recommendations? And in what specific area you think enhanced cooperation is required, and how can that be achieved?
Thank you very much, Dr. Noura, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone here in this team panel. I think all of the currently, there's not really a single universally agreed upon pathway of all the different pathways and technologies, even the ones that Yoshi had mentioned. Different countries have different priorities. Sometimes they're competing priorities. Some of the tasks, perhaps, for example, some carbon taxes that could be implemented in one country could even have a negative or side effects on other countries as well beyond their borders. While we have ambitious climate targets, they're not really binding on governments. And beyond that, aside from a decarbonization policy gap, even within countries that do have some policies, sometimes it is very hard to implement those policies domestically because it is not always mandatory for corporations to report their emissions either. And in the this policy gap environment, there is really no clear definition that is agreed upon on how to measure emissions and how to report them and how to certify them. But yet there is an implicit assumption that we can do so. But there's not really one method to do that. And we see that also very clearly even in the market-based solutions that you've mentioned. For example, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement has the carbon market mechanism system, but there's no real agreed upon governing rules for the system. So the absence of these agreed upon measures, basically what it does is that it harms investments. It reduces incentives to invest in technological improvements that would support the different energy transition pathways. And it also could potentially punish even some of the technologies, particularly in the hard-to-abate sectors. At the same time, there is opportunity for misreporting by companies or even underreporting, and sometimes potentially double accounting if we don't account for emissions appropriately in the different phases of production. And more importantly, there's opportunities for carbon leakage. And what I mean by that is it is easy at the moment in the current environment to have operations, for example, being transferred from a jurisdiction where there's significant climate policy regulations to another jurisdiction where there is none. So this is really the lack of these agreed upon measures for measuring and verifying and certifying greenhouse gas emissions really is a significant problem in advancing various types of energy transition pathways, not only CCE. And to answer the second part of your question, I've had the pleasure to work with fantastic colleagues on submitting a policy brief as one of the policy briefs that have been discussed and accepted in the task force. And what we specifically highlighted are areas of cooperation and enhanced collaboration globally, particularly in measuring emissions, reporting them, and certifying them. And our goal really was to think of something that is feasible but also affordable, can afford and implement an institutional regulatory landscape, while at the same time allowing the flexibility for different jurisdictions and different countries to implement the policy regulations domestically, and to also incentivize both compliance by different companies, including energy companies, and at the same time facilitating the process of compliance and supporting incentives in technology pathways. And to do that, we've really, in our policy brief, we have called upon the G20 to adopt consistent rules for measuring, reporting, and certifying emissions, and to also create a mixed membership, sort of a private and public body to implement 3 different actions that we have proposed. And these actions are in the 3 areas that I've highlighted, namely measuring carbon emissions, which we propose that would be done really a life cycle, like treatment, including emissions at the final processing, and having that feed into some sort of an emissions inventory at some level that's also shared internationally. And then the second step, once there are carbon that's measured, is to report the emissions and to also verify them. And we propose that should be in a uniform and transparent way, which at the moment there's very large, significant policy gaps in this regard. So we've proposed even generally accepted accounting principles for emissions, similar to what we have already in the accounting system, but something for emissions specifically, like a GAP-E framework, and to implement that also through the different, consistently internationally and through the different, in different countries, and importantly to share the information of the emissions that's being reported along the sale. So there is a sale of an energy good, and also the emissions products of it is also shared, and hopefully blockchain technology and new technologies would facilitate the reporting of emissions consistently and sharing that information. And finally, the final stage is the certification. So creating a body that would adopt an internationally recognized methodology to certify emissions would also follow the GAP-E that would be important in reporting in a way that's also consistent across the different countries. What we really hope through this framework that we propose is not that it would just be implemented initially, but it would be implemented and become really a norm, so that climate policies would become kind of the prevailing norm in the different, the energy policy as well. And then hopefully enhance the commitment of governments and corporations to reduce carbon as well.
Thank you very much, Manal, for this excellent presentation on this very much needed framework, this GAP-E framework that help institutionalize CCE really and help create a generally accepted, standard for countries to follow. Last but not least, we have the pleasure of welcoming Antonio Villafranca, the SP coordinator of T20 Italy, and the Director of Studies and co-head of the Center of Europe and Global Governance in ISPI Italy. Antonio, the circular carbon economy derives its approach from the circular economy. Could you help us in understanding what is the EU's stance and actions with regards to the circular economy?
Thank you very much, Noura. Thank you for hosting this event together. Let me go straight to your question. Actually, in the EU, the circular carbon economy is framed as an extension of the circular economy, which is based, as has been said many times, which is part and parcel of the EU approach to carbon CO2 emission. Let me focus particularly on the EU strategies and actions to move from linear to circular economic models. So let's start from the strategy. The rationale behind the EU approach to circular economy is obviously based on the 3 R's. So it's reduce, use, recycle, have been said many times. So basically the same R's, of course, of the circular carbon economy, but without the last R, which is remove. According to some estimates, for instance, from the Circularity Gap Report 2020, the global economy is circular only for 8.6%. This means that over 90% of the resources entering the economy which amounts more or less to 100 billion tons per year, are wasted. In addition, global consumption of materials such as biomass, fossil fuels, metals, and minerals is expected to double in the next 40 years, while annual waste generation is projected to increase by 70% by 2050. So promoting the efficient use of resources by moving to a circular economy is a priority for the G20 agenda, and it is also at the heart of the EU action towards climate neutrality. In particular, in the aftermath of COVID-19, circular economy approaches have the potential to play a crucial role in the stimulus packages by promoting a green, low carbon, and circular post-coronavirus economic recovery, including in the EU, of course, the next generation EU, which deserves about 40%, which 40% of the projects which have to be submitted by member states to the European Union must be focused on green transition, and of course circular carbon economy or circular economy as a whole can be a part, of course, of it. In particular, the EU aims when it comes to circular economy are to protect, conserve, and enhance the Union's natural capital, turn the Union into a resource-efficient, green, and competitive low-carbon economy, safeguard the Union's citizens from environment-related pressures and risk to health and well-being. So boosting the efficient use of resources by moving to a clean and circular economy is a fundamental step in reaching all these objectives. So this is for the strategy and the rationale behind the EU stance on circular economy. Now let's come to the actions which have been taken so far by the European Union. The EU adopted the first Circular Economy Action Plan in 2015, and it has already delivered all the 54 actions contained in that plan. Its action is now guided by a new Circular Economy Action Plan, which was adopted just in last year, in March 2020. The new action plan announces initiatives along the entire life cycle of products. It targets how products are designed, promotes circular economy processes, encourages sustainable consumption, and aims to ensure that waste is prevented and the resources are used are kept in the EU economy for as long as possible. This new action plan is composed by 35 actions that mostly aim to make sustainable products the norm in the EU and ensure less waste, focus on the sectors that use most resources and where the potential for circularity is high, such as electronics and ICT, batteries and vehicles, packaging, plastics, textiles, construction, buildings, food, water, and nutrients. Make circularity work for people, regions, and cities, lead global efforts on circular economy. So let me conclude on why actually the circular economy is gaining central stage in the EU. Circular economy principle across the EU economy has the potential to increase the EU GDP by an additional 0.5% by 2030, creating 700,000 new jobs. These are the data provided by the EU Commission itself. Between 2012 and 2018, the number of jobs linked to the circular economy in the EU grew by 5% to reach around 4 million. So job creation is key in the strategy of the European Union. The European Union is a front runner in the fight against climate change, in energy efficiency, but it's not, like dividing between the bad and good guys at the world level. So, the European Union is the good guy. I mean, there is, of course, a strategy, also a competitive strategy behind all that, and job creation and competitiveness, of course, are two key drivers. Of course, and also Luiz mentioned in his remarks, job creation must be facilitated and supported by investment and reforms in education and training. Those are absolutely key drivers of any engagement in this kind of for this kind of achievements. Last point, there is a clear business case for individual companies too, since manufacturing firms in the EU spend on average about 40% on materials. Closed-loop models can increase their profitability while sheltering them from resource price fluctuations. So again, it is in the interest of the European Union itself. So I will stop here and go back to you.
Thank you very much for this excellent answer, Antonio. Indeed, the circular economy is gaining global momentum, and the G20 should really capitalize on this and continue the discussions and the momentum from the Saudi G20 presidency and going forward. If I can go back to you, Luiz, and if you can tell us very briefly, from the OECD perspective, how can we prompt investments to facilitate carbon circularity, the circular carbon economy, and ultimately the green transition?
Thanks, Noura. This is, I think, a very, very important point that you are making about investment. Now, I think we've all talked here about different policy areas. Investment in the end is key. Part of it is public investment, and Antonio mentioned that in the case of the European experience, is basically deploying budgetary tools. It's using the tax system through rebates and credits and so on. It's also using the subsidies that can be used to this end. But a part of it is also making sure that the public action can help the development of private sectors. I think what Manal mentioned is very important in this area. It's to create conditions for the private sector, for the financial markets, then to act, to have a role in this, to basically ensure efficient capital allocation towards decarbonization, to facilitate the assessment of risk, to facilitate price discovery. This is all part of certification to this end. Let's not forget, I think, Noura, we are going through a historic moment here. The global economy is recovering from a crisis, and it is a crisis that provides an opportunity not only to create the conditions for GDP to get back to the levels we had before the pandemic, but also to make sure that in doing so, we are facilitating this transition to a lower carbon economy. The policy areas that we are talking about, that the task force is dealing with, is about making sure that happens, but also that we measure and recognize the transition costs. Antonio just mentioned it a minute ago. This is a crucial part to ensuring societies buy in for what will need to be done to make sure that this path to a lower carbon economy, this transition, is also accepted by society. It's not only about technology, it's not only about public policies, it's not about public funds and helping the private sector. It's also making sure that society is behind it and accepts that there are policy actions that will need to be made towards a goal that is ultimately about meeting agreed climate change targets. So I think the option for us here is to make sure that we understand all the policy tools that can be used and that we deploy them in a way that leads us to that end with society with us in this journey. So I think those are probably the messages that I think that we can put forward as part of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Luiz. And John, if I can bring you in the conversation ahead of COP26. What role do you see for CCE in raising ambitions of NDCs, stronger climate change adaptation, energy transition towards carbon circularity and neutrality, and increasing government support for a clean energy transition?
Noura, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. It's a central role for COP26, the Glasgow summit on November 1st to 12th this year, and in everything leading up to it. What we do know is that at the most recent G7 meeting of environment ministers meeting, chaired by Boris Johnson, who has joined Mario Draghi, the Prime Minister of Italy, who's co-chairing our G20. Both of them are co-chairing the Glasgow COP. So in the run-up, they're doing everything they can to make it work. I was struck by the fact that at that most recent G7 meeting, where half of the G20 members were and more participating, they called for more ambitious NDCs many times. They called for nature-based solutions, and they endorsed the circular economy in many ways, using it to reduce the pressure on our natural environment, reduce resource use, maximize the value of materials through a life cycle approach, as Antonio has just highlighted, curb biodiversity loss, and support climate mitigation and adaptation. They also specifically promised more sustainable food consumption and production, and reduced food loss and waste, and industrial energy and resource efficiency. And they made many strong commitments to act. Let me just cite one. In addition to action on the ocean and forests, we commit to taking urgent actions across ecosystems, including soils, grasslands, savanna, drylands, wetlands, coral reefs, rivers, lake, coastal dunes, peatland, seagrass, mangrove, and salt marshes. And I'm pleased to see that many of those nature-based solutions are included in the top 15 policy briefs that Task Force 2 has. Our task now is to make sure that they're accepted by T20 as a whole, and then by the G20, which ends its summit a day before Glasgow starts.
Thank you very much, John. And Yoshi, if we can bring in the Japanese perspective, I know Japan has great ambitions for hydrogen, and hydrogen is seen as the Swiss knife, the CCE, cross-cutting solutions to carbon circularity and neutrality. And the world has seen the first shipment of blue ammonia going from Saudi Arabia to Japan. Can you talk about the potential of using fossil fuels for clean hydrogen? Very briefly, please. I'm a bit mindful of the time.
Okay, thank you for your noting our ammonia experience. As I mentioned, based on the agreement between Saudi Arabia and the Japanese government, we conducted the demonstration project to produce and shipping and using blue ammonia last year, and it was successfully done. And we had big expectations on the ammonia. Actually, we don't, strictly speaking, we don't really care about the color of ammonia, either blue or green. But as far as I understand, given the expected size of ammonia demand, at least in Japan, green ammonia or ammonia based on green hydrogen has some limitation in terms of production capacity. We need both green and blue hydrogen for ammonia to meet our demand. And recently, Japanese government announced that the sort of target, not really a formalized target, but it's kind of benchmark. And as of 2050, we will raise the share of hydrogen or ammonia in the power generation mix up to 10% as of 2050. So we are now seriously working on to utilize hydrogen or ammonia in a power generation mix.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. And Manal, if I can go back to you and the International Cooperation for CCE. So what would be an appropriate conceptual framework to achieve the international cooperation in the areas that you mentioned?
Thanks for the question. So as I mentioned, importantly, what we want is something that is acceptable at an international level, but also implemented at a local level. And in the 3-action framework that we propose, we're also aware that there could be a challenge of the lack of credible and reliable independent companies that could undertake measuring and certifying, or the possibility of one entity maybe monopolizing this process, which would then create opportunities for collusion and even unethical violations. And that's precisely why our conceptual framework is really to have this international body that I mentioned, which has internationally agreed upon measurements and standards, but then they work through implemented through maybe local chapters, for example, and institutional framework within the domestic, the different economies, so within their domestic, international domestic framework. What would also part of the framework we're presenting is not really reinventing the wheel, but really working with the already existing skills, so to speak, in certifying and measuring emissions. And to get to an agreed gap that we proposed, we recognize that it will be very important to for the G20 to have the buy-in from the different participants. So perhaps investing in one or more international public institutions that could commence or launch a brainstorming and consultation process over some time, which can elaborate then on the required gap that could be agreed upon within a particular time frame. But to have that really be affordable, practical, and also implementable, the consultation process should really engage the G20, the UNFCCC, so the different stakeholders, but also developing economies that might have different capabilities and different skills there as well. But at the same time involve actors, as Luiz has mentioned earlier, so the private sector that are already active in the energy sector, as well as existing capabilities or companies that are experts in measuring and certifying emissions. So that's kind of the larger framework that we're proposing.
Thank you very much, Manal. And Antonio, if we can end with the EU perspective again, could the circular carbon economy be a viable approach for the EU?
Well, first of all, just to be sure, I mean, the carbon circular economy at the moment has not been formally adopted by the EU. It means that there is no EU legislation on that. In a way, let's say that the EU is still studying on that. So, I mean, legislation, regulation could be just around the corner. Why I'm saying so? Because if you take, for instance, the carbon dioxide removal, now there are a number of options which are currently under discussion in Brussels. In terms of measures, they range from nature-based practices such as forestation, soil carbon sequestration, and wetland restoration, to technological alternatives such as enhanced weathering by energy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture and storage. So just to be short, the European Commission even now recognizes the crucial role of carbon dioxide removal and intends to focus on nature-based options. An extended revision of the EU climate mitigation legislation planned for this year, so it should come, should be out this year, so will provide an opportunity to set a regulatory framework for SDR.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We came to the end of this T20 Spring Roundtable on the quest for a circular carbon economy, co-promoted by ISPI and CAPSARC, and in cooperation with the G20 Research Group, the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, the OECD, and the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Thank you all for this lively and very interesting discussion. And I leave you, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.